Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 6th of November, and as always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information. You can do that easily by calling 1-800-472-0391. That's the Alaska Weather Information Line, or find us online at weather.gov/Alaska. Once you click on that, you'll have opportunities to go to the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit page, the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center, the National Tsunami Warning Center, or any of your local forecast offices in Fairbanks, Juneau, or Anchorage. And if you still can't find what you need, please do let me know. I'm happy to help you out anytime I can. Just send me an email at david.snider@noaa.gov. Here's a look at what's going on around your Alaska tonight. Up north, we have wind and snow. That's going to be a problem for many locations. The wind also causing some coastal issues. We'll talk about the snow first. A winter weather advisory is in effect now for the Brooks Range. That'll start through the evening and overnight hours, and we're expecting in those regions to have some blowing snow through probably a good 24 hours or so. I'll look for some of those regions to have gusts upwards of 60 to 65 miles per hour. Around the Chukchi coast, especially north of Kivalina, gusts to 60 miles an hour are possible here, so high wind warnings are in effect there, and all the way out towards St. Lawrence Island as well. And parts of the Seward Peninsula are also under a high wind warning. Those gusts, again, anywhere from 60 to maybe 80 miles per hour. Now, as you would expect, with the wind coming in to Norton Sound and in sea ice-free areas at Kotzebue Sound, we're also dealing with coastal flood advisories and high surf advisories, and those are in effect for areas of Kotzebue Sound and for Norton Sound. And for regions a little bit further into the mainland area, the Noatak and Kobuk Valley areas, especially around and also down toward the Pilgrim Hot Springs area across the Teller Road, we're expecting to see some decent amounts of snow. So winter storm warnings are also in effect. Those are the areas shaded in red here. And we're expecting as much as 5 to 7 inches around the Teller Road area in the Pilgrim Hot Springs region. Could see as much as 11 inches of snow in that area, and also around Nulato Hills. So we're expecting to see 4 to 7 inches of snow in that region, with as much as 12. And then north of Ambler, as you head up into the foothills there, 4 to 7 inches of snow, perhaps as much as 13 in isolated cases. So we have quite a bit of wind that's blowing the snow around, reducing visibility. We have wind that is going to be pushing water toward the coast and perhaps creating some coastal flood issues there and high surf. And we also have more snow on the way. And if that's not all, if you look about 5 to 6, 7 days out, as we head toward the weekend, another surge of low pressures coming our way. So a lot going on in a very active period for northern Alaska. Here's a look at the weather situation now, and you know, just a quick glance in the Gulf, and you can see the spiral here from a storm force low that is still keeping storm force winds close to the outer coast and high-end gales across most of southeast. Windy conditions throughout today, and it looks like the wind will continue at least for the overnight hours and into tomorrow before that starts to abate a little bit, but conditions up around the northern Lynn Canal, Haines and Skagway, and all the way down into the southern inner channels will continue to be fairly rough during that period. A little bit of a break from that storm into the south central and interior regions, and then we're back into this very large circulation across eastern Asia. A fast-moving front working across the Bering Sea is moving toward western Alaska, especially northwestern Alaska. And with the ample amount of moisture there and all that running into the mountains of the western Brooks Range, and also the Seward Peninsula, as well as pushing that air across and pushing forward the extra water here across Norton Sound and Kotzebue Sound, because we're sea ice free at the moment in those areas mostly. We are creating that the warnings and advisories that you just saw there. So as this system is moving eastward, seeing additional cloud cover across the interior, but the bulk of the weather pattern is moving in through the evening hours from about 6 to 9 o'clock tonight across the west and northwestern Alaska. You'll see the weather deteriorate fairly quickly as we go ahead into the overnight hours there. Behind that, plenty of cold, and once again, another system well behind that looks even more vigorous as we head toward Friday and into Saturday. Here's a look at the weather map right now. High pressure sitting across the Yukon Flats and up across the upper Yukon Valley. 1,034 millibars. A few snow showers floating around the western and southern side of that. Low pressure also sitting out across the Gulf at 981 millibars, spreading some rain and some snow out towards Sitka, though as we understand it, it's a very non-accumulating snow, I guess, around the Sitka region, and very dry conditions even further north of that toward Gustavus, Haines, and Skagway. So windy conditions, not a big wet or snowy weather producer at the moment, but certainly one that's creating a lot of wind. High pressure sitting across Bristol Bay, 1,030 millibars, and here is our front working across the Bering, spreading rain showers across the central chain, but there is a fog just preceding what's going to be a pretty good wind and snowmaker for northwestern Alaska. As we get into tonight, watch for areas of blowing snow across the Brooks Range again. Winter weather advisories posted for that. As the front moves ashore, watch for snow to develop across the parts of the Seward Peninsula, across the northern Yukon Delta, and across some of the higher terrain of the Brooks Range coming down toward Ambler and Bettles. And again, some of those areas could see sizable accumulations on the order of 10 to 12 inches on the high end, but most places probably talking about 3 to 5, maybe 7 inches of snow as we get through your Tuesday. The stronger winds will push eastward as we get into Tuesday afternoon, so the eastern Brooks Range will go under that winter weather advisory. Behind that, a strong flow in from the west and southwest into Norton Sound and into parts of the south-facing coastlines of the Seward Peninsula and into Kotzebue Sound, as well as the Chukchi Coast, and we're going to watch for some areas to see some higher surf than usual, so don't be surprised if you have at least some minor coastal flooding in those regions. And again, if that's a wind direction that is not so good for your village, it's probably time to start moving things away from the shore if that's going to be an issue for you tonight and tomorrow. Across southeast, still an opportunity for some light precipitation as that storm force low is backing its way slowly southward. High pressure scoots off to the east a little bit. Fair weather for south central all the way down toward Kodiak Island, and probably still a little bit of a breeze around Valdez after high wind warning still in effect for the afternoon today. As we get into Wednesday, another front coming in from the west. That'll keep snow showers going, at least in earnest, maybe even some light snow as we get into the middle Yukon Valley and up toward the Kobuk and Noatak valleys. Again, this is really focusing on those south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range. So if you're on the south side of the hill all the way out toward the western coast, this is going to produce precipitation and wind for you. Mixed precipitation, rain and snow, possible around Norton Sound and the Yukon Delta, and northward is just going to be wind, snow, and poor visibility there as we get into the midweek. Rain showers all the way from the Kuskokwim Delta out toward the western chain, and southeast slowly pulling out of this storm force low as it's dropping southward. We'll start to pull in even drier air. Still a little bit of a breeze as we get into Wednesday, but not as bad as it has been the last couple days. So, warnings of wind and snow and poor visibility, especially north and west. Let's take a look at your temperatures. As we get into tomorrow morning, it's going to cool off considerably. In fact, cool down toward about 0 around Eagle, 1 below in Northway, 2 below in Fort Yukon, 9 below in Arctic Village. Teens and 20s for the North Slope. Notice the west under the influences of that very wet and warm wind coming in. That's going to keep things mixed up, and with that, 20s and 30s for most areas. Nome only 30. Bristol Bay temperatures a little bit cooler, teens and 20s there, 20s and 30s for the Alaska Peninsula, and 30s, maybe even low 40s out around Dutch Harbor and Unalaska. 36 for St. Paul, 20s and 30s for southeast. Highs tomorrow back in the 30s too, as warm as low 40s from Sitka out toward Ketchikan, Craig, Klawock. South Central back in the mid 30s, probably just a hair below freezing in Anchorage. Single digits and low teens for the upper Yukon and upper Tanana Valley. 8 in Fort Yukon, 20s for the North Slope. 20s and 30s, maybe just above freezing at around Point Hope. 35 around Nome. The YK Delta back in the mid to upper 30s. Nunivak Island could hold close to 40 degrees tomorrow afternoon, 42 in St. Paul, and about 44 for Dutch Harbor and Unalaska. As we get into Wednesday morning, notice we're still holding on to that very dry and cold air thanks to high pressure here across western Canada. That's going to keep things nice and chilly there around Northway, 6 below, one of the colder spots it looks like midweek. Down into the teens for the North Slope. The West Coast, 28 degrees in Nome. St. Lawrence Island, Gamble, and Sabunga, very close to freezing. 20s for most of the southwestern coast, 31 around Nunivak Island, 31 for Kodiak Island as well. Closer to 40 degrees for the Alaska Peninsula. Sand Point only in the upper 30s, 40 in Dutch Harbor and Unalaska, and about the same for Adak and Atka, Shimya near 38. Southeast, expect morning low temperatures Wednesday in the 20s to lower 30s. Many locations north of Ketchikan and Craig and Sitka will likely be below freezing as we get into Wednesday. Here's a look at Wednesday afternoon. Still in the single digits and teens for most of the upper Yukon and upper Tanana valleys. Looks like Copper River Valley probably only in the mid-teens there around Golcana. 23 for Fairbanks. 30s for many along the west coast. Norton Sound and Unalakleet, probably low 30s there. Kotzebue 28. St. Paul still holding around 40 degrees. It looks like the Alaska Peninsula will warm just a bit more into the mid-40s throughout the day. As you get out toward Dutch Harbor and Unalaska, 45 degrees. Not a big change as you move further westward out across the Aleutians. Prince William Sound temperatures, Cordova and Valdez, back in the mid-30s, with Kodiak coming in at a mild 42 degrees.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
On to flying weather now. You can see a long stretch of cloud cover and lower ceilings and visibility along a frontal boundary that's moving into the west coast as we start up your Tuesday morning. And we're still dealing with residual low ceilings and visibility from the central and eastern sections of the Gulf, and that storm system that's gradually drifting south and east. IFR may linger across some of the higher terrain of the Misty Fjords, MVFR for many other locations. And along the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range and the upper Yukon upper Yukon Valley and the Yukon Flats region, we're still looking at some poor visibility. That should improve as we go through Tuesday. As the front moves ashore, the YK Delta may see lingering areas of IFR through the afternoon, as well as the upper Kobuk and Noatak valleys out toward the western edge of Kotzebue Sound and out across St. Lawrence Island. Watch for decreasing ceilings and visibility with IFR developing there. MVFR along the next wave all the way through the central and western chain. As we get into your Wednesday, it looks like increasing areas of IFR should be the rule as we get into the south-facing slopes of the western Brooks Range, into the Kobuk and Noatak valleys and the Koyukuk, all the way into the upper Kuskokwim and McGrath. A large part of the YK Delta will mainly be under MVFR conditions through a start on Wednesday morning, but watch for some areas of IFR to stretch even further south toward the Wood-Tikchik Mountains. And across the western chain, IFR conditions there and MVFR conditions improving across a large part of southeast by Wednesday morning, but you'll still see some issues out across the open water. Those are shrinking by the afternoon. And hit and miss IFR across the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range for Wednesday afternoon. Also across the central interior and across the upper Kuskokwim and lower Yukon valleys and out across Lake Iliamna, west of the Alaska Range out toward the YK Delta, with MVFR fairly widespread across the southern Bering and Bristol Bay and out toward the central and western chain. On to your individual pass maps for tomorrow. Look for Anaktuvik Pass and Anigan Pass to remain at IFR conditions. Looks like that'll be the trend as we look up north for the next couple days, but southern ranges and passes should be generally okay. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, we expect to see VFR conditions there. And for Rainy Pass, holding at VFR through most of your Tuesday. Windy Pass looks to be A-okay. And as you get into Isabel Pass and points eastward, VFR should continue all the way out toward Mentasta Pass. Tonita Pass, we expect to see VFR. Porter's Pass at this point looks pretty good with the storm system well to the south, and Fort Chilkoot and White Pass also with the storm well off to the south. VFR conditions are expected to continue there into Wednesday. Here's your freezing levels now, and you can see the storm to the south is still sloshing in some warm air across coastal sections of central and southern southeast. However, freezing levels have dropped off now to about 4,000 foot levels there across the southern and central outer coast. The surface freezing line right over the Panhandle as well. And as you look northward, you also get into that ridge where we've sent a lot of warm air north toward the Arctic coast on that strong and stiff southerly flow, anywhere from 2 to 4, even 6 and 8,000 foot levels there across the west coast. Bristol Bay closer to the 8,000 foot level, and it looks like Kodiak Island somewhere between about 4 and 8,000 feet, with the Aleutians holding between 2 and 4. So the icing potential then not quite as great as we've seen it in the last couple of days. It'll be fairly high up there for most of southeast, isolated areas above 10,000 feet. Across the north slope, that'll be the lowest level we see, about 5,000 to 6,000 feet there, with some considerable moderate potential there north of Barrow. And then further south you go along that dying frontal boundary. You can see the collection of moisture there, but it's still holding some pretty high levels up there, above 10,000 feet. And out across the west, still a wealth of warm air with the greatest potential for any icing still high up there, around 10,000 feet and above. Here's a look at the jet stream, and we have that ridge in place across the mainland. You can see the Pacific jet blowing in across the Bering, 70 to 100 knots there, and then the jet really picks up on that northerly component, but that's already moving into Canada with another trough sweeping that eastward. So we're left with the storm out over the Gulf of Alaska with wind speeds pretty strong, 65 knots outside of Prince William Sound in the northern Gulf, and then stretching into 150 knot gust, sustained winds wrapping into low pressure there, and more of a westerly component over southeast at this point. At 9,000 feet, here's our low pressure system over the Gulf, but a broad westerly flow is taking shape and moving into western Alaska, 30 to 50 knots there, generally from the west, and the ridge is on the way out east. You see this mirrored at 3,000 feet. Wind speeds between 40 and about 50 knots across the western Bering. Wind speeds slowing down across the interior from the south and west, anywhere from 20 to about 40 knots there. Southeast still under the influence of that low pressure system in the Gulf. So turbulence we'll be watching out in the west below 4,000 feet. Southeast still dealing with some chop and bumps thanks to the storm over the Gulf below 6,000 feet and increasing areas of turbulence out across the chain.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
The Space Weather Prediction Center has had a long-standing relationship with the power industry, so they've been aware that solar storms, the geomagnetic storm piece of that, can affect the operation of their systems and induce extra currents and loads on those systems that can either trip those systems offline or in the worst of cases, cause damage. That relationship goes back for several decades. In fact, a big incident in 1989 where part of Quebec was tripped offline that affected something like 6 million customers for about 9 hours. I think that really raised the awareness in the power industries.
When we get the alert, we watch the grid and start looking for issues. Are we seeing a decline in voltage? Are we seeing equipment failures? And we readjust the system to try to mitigate those problems, try to keep the lights on and keep it from going out.
So we're averaging about 500, 550 kilometers per second.
If we didn't have this early warning, we wouldn't see it until our sensor saw it. Getting more information quicker and faster before the storm hits, not during the storm, is a big improvement.
In the long term, I think what we need and what we're moving toward, the U.S. as a whole, is better modeling, fully understanding this phenomenon, understanding how it would impact specific systems.
Rather than actually experiencing a storm, we can simulate storms in our software and see what the impact is. We try to get ahead of it. We always plan that if there's an outage, how can we keep the lights on? What's the best process to prevent it?
In the end, 5-10 years from now, there's going to be a whole mix of operational procedures driven by what we do on prediction and warning. And then there also will probably be some level of hardware controls to ensure the reliability of the grid.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
There's different types of impacts on communication systems, and the HF we call the high frequency, which is that band of communications 3 to 30 megahertz. But it's a very important band of radio communication because it's used widespread. It's used, for example, by the airlines.
HF radio is most commonly used for position reporting when you're going across the ocean airspace, which is devoid of radar. And ATC can't see you, so it's up to you to report your position and your altitude and your speed.
HF works great most of the time, except during a big flare. During a big flare, that HF communication capability could be gone within a minute or two. So as soon as we see something happening in there or we see a flare, it's one of the first things we do is alert the aviation community, hey, big flare, HF's going to be impacted.
Once we know that there's an event going on, then the aviation industry and the airlines can react to that. They can alter their routes over the poles. They can lower the altitudes that they're flying at, or maybe decide not to fly at all in the interest of the passenger safety.
So that's just one example of how HF is used, but the emergency response community will use it a lot too. It's one of their primary backups.
When you've lost connectivity between certain government agencies, it gives you that long-range coverage to talk from out of state to federal governments or from the FEMA locations to the state emergency operations centers.
So if you've got a big hurricane impact in the coastline, whatever big city, we've got the cell towers down and whatnot, we've got emergency communication folks in there. Those folks are very familiar with space weather and how it impacts their systems.
Here in recent years, it was used during Katrina when we had a lot of communications outages down there. It was also used during Hurricane Ike. There was an outage of the telephone circuits with the Texas State Emergency Office, so it was used in both of those situations.
So when we talk about backup, especially for the airlines, typically they'll have SATCOM, so that'll be satellite communication.
The satellite technology that emergency responders use could be GPSs, could be satellite phones, satellite data terminals.
Space weather events can impact SATCOMs. The impact can range from a nuisance to loss of a spacecraft. So we will give them the heads up. If we have space weather events, flares, whatnot, they need to know what's impacting their systems. Situational awareness is key. Time is of essence to these folks. Again, it's life and death.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Time for a quick check of your sea ice edge, and you can see that ice is growing across the Beaufort seacoast at this point. However, strong winds are going to be moving up through the western side of the Arctic coast and in through Kotzebue Sound, so anything that's along the coastline right now will likely have some opportunity to be broken up. And eventually warmer areas moving eastward as well. The winds may come up a little bit more around the Beaufort seacoast a little bit later in the week. In the time you want to check out the latest sea ice conditions, you can do that by going to weather.gov/Anchorage/ice and check out the latest outlook and a map similar to this that will allow you to check on conditions closer to where you're interested in your part of Alaska. Let's take a look at southeast. The storm force winds are still going on across the outer coast tonight, but the overall system is dropping southward as we get into Tuesday and for Wednesday. However, that's going to make more wind in different places, and for the Lynn Canal, storm force winds coming up there from the north, 50 knots with a 12-foot sea, gusts to 65 miles per hour. Some ferry service has already been canceled. I believe the Aurora is the ferry there in that case. Northerlies through Stevens Passage and Clarence Strait, 30 to 35 knots in the region with gusts to 60 around Stevens Passage. The outer coast winds looking at sustained up to 40 to 45, gusts to 60 and 65 there south of Sitka. So be prepared for pretty blustery conditions at that, considering what we're dealing with on Monday. Looks like conditions should be a little bit better in some cases on Tuesday, and then by the time you get to Wednesday, much improved. One exception though, Lynn Canal still looking at gusts to 60 with northerlies at 40, sustained 10-foot seas there and 5 to 6-foot seas elsewhere in the inner channels. Looking at an offshore flow all the way up from Dixon Entrance to Gustavus, about 15 to 25 knots, 12 to 16-foot seas there. You can still see higher seas out in the offshore areas as well. Northwesterlies from Prince William Sound eastward towards southeast, 10-foot seas on a 15-knot wind. For south central, certainly much nicer conditions, 10 to 20 knots in most areas. Northerlies inside of Prince William Sound, 3-foot seas there, 12 to 13-foot seas across the north and western Gulf. 25-knot winds from the north, west of the Barren Islands, 8-foot seas expected there, 10-knot winds in the northern Cook Inlet region. Becoming northwesterly as we get into Wednesday. Stronger westerlies across the Barrens, 25 knots there with 8 to 10 foot seas, light winds, small seas inside of Prince William Sound, and north and westerly winds across the north and western Gulf for the midweek. For Bristol Bay, a light southeasterly flow, 10 knots, 2 foot seas there. Westerlies down the coast at 25 knots with a 7 foot sea. You can see the higher seas offshore, but closer to the coastline, looking at about 9 to 13 foot seas there from Sandpoint all the way up toward AKwx. Looking at 10 to 20 knot winds on Tuesday, becoming 15 to 20 knot winds on Wednesday. Inside of Shelikof Strait, 20 knots from the west with a 4 foot sea, northwesterlies east of Kodiak Island, and westerlies blowing into into Bristol Bay, 15 to 20, looking at 5 to 8 foot seas there during the midweek. For your Tuesday in the chain, look for 15 to 25 knots in most areas, 6 to 10 foot seas across the Bering Sea coast, 12 to 14 foot seas in the western chain, 25 to 30 knots from the south and west and northwesterlies as you get into the Pacific coastline across the central and eastern chain. 8 to maybe even 7 feet as you head out toward the east with higher seas well to the north. As you get to the west coast, you'll notice that the higher seas are still around the Pribilofs in north and west, but for Wednesday, not a whole lot of change there in the chain. A south and westerly flow, 15 to 25, and seas ranging from about 7 to 9 feet in all areas. On to the west again, west and southwesterlies out toward the Delta as well as Norton Sound, 6 to 14 foot seas, 17 foot seas around St. Matthew, 10 foot seas for St. Paul and St. George on a 30 knot wind from the south and west. A stronger westerly push coming in, and again this will lead some areas to see some high surf and perhaps even some minor coastal flooding there, especially across the south-facing coastline of the Seward Peninsula and into Norton Sound. Winter storm warnings are also posted for some of the inland areas, seas ranging from 12 to 15 feet. Southerlies coming up through the Chukchi coast also presenting an issue for coastal problems. 11 to 16 foot seas there, 4 foot seas to counter that across the Beaufort, 20 knot winds from the south and east. Becoming a little stronger as we head into Wednesday, 4 to 5 foot seas, 11 foot seas around Barrow, and 13 to 14 foot seas continue around the Chukchi with 35 knot winds over mostly open water. Let's recap tonight's weather. Cold front is moving ashore, and with that, strong winds working across the west coast. Winter storm warnings also posted for areas north of Ambler. You could see as much as 10 to 12 inches of snow and to the west. Winter weather advisories for the Brooks Range. That'll continue to track east or from the west to the east. Poor visibility being the main issue there. Storm force low in the Gulf is dropping southward, but it's still going to be a blustery day across a large part of southeast. The weather continues to improve heading into Wednesday, and more snow will continue for the central and western interior. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather. We'll see you right here again tomorrow.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.